Parents across the country who just want to give their children a good old-fashioned childhood are now second-guessing common sense parenting decisions out of fear that these decisions will result in a visit from the police or CPS. And kids are losing the freedom to just be kids. Raising children with limited parental supervision to encourage independence is a hot-button issue. The question that we'll be discussing today is whether Texas parents can grant their children reasonable freedoms without running afoul of the law. And to help us, we're joined by an incredible panel of experts on this topic. All two of you. Lenore Skenazy is the president of Let Grow, a national nonprofit organization that is creating a path for parents, schools, and the nation back to a place where kids can have adventures, develop more independence, and grow resilient. She rose to prominence in 2008 after her column, Why I Let My 9-Year-Old Ride the Subway Alone, landed her on a number of national talk shows, including The Today Show, Dr. Phil, and even The Daily Show. From there, she published the book and blog Free Range Kids, which launched the free range parenting movement, and as she informed me this morning, she copyrighted the term free range parenting. Lenore lectures internationally and has been profiled by the New York Times and the New Yorker. She's even a reality TV show host, working with the Discovery Channel on a show cheekily titled World's Worst Mom. She holds a bachelor's degree from Yale and a master's from Columbia. Lenore and her husband live in New York where they're empty nesters because their sons have safely flown the coop.
They weren't abducted. Right.
Trevor Woodruff is with us as well. We're honored to have him here. Trevor has been with the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services since 2006 and was appointed Deputy Commissioner in 2016. During his tenure with the department's legal division, he served in a number of positions before being promoted to General Counsel. Prior to joining the department, Trevor was in private practice with a substantial portion of his work devoted to representing parents and children in CPS cases. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Texas Tech University and a doctorate of jurisprudence from the Texas Tech School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Lenore and Trevor.
Wait, I'm welcoming you. And you.
Lenore mentioned that we just have all two of our panelists here. Right. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Corey Widen, was unable to join us at the last minute. We do have a video that we'll be showing a bit later on of an interview that she gave with Good Morning America telling her family's incredible story. But before we get to that video, I'd like to start with Lenore and ask you to provide a little context for the conversation that we'll be having today.
Okay, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for having the guy in the luncheon ask, is anybody from New York? I'm like, yeah, maybe one of us, yes. And I'm really happy to be here with you, Trevor. So as you said, I came to whatever prominence I've come to when I let my 9-year-old ride the subway alone, which was something that my son had been asking to do. And in New York, we get around by the subway. Not here, I know. And so one sunny Sunday, I took him to Bloomingdale's, a place he'd never been before. He wanted to go someplace he'd never been before and find his own way home. I let him do it. He was ecstatic that he had been finally allowed to do something that made him feel grown up, and he knew that his parents believed in him, and he came through the door like levitating. It was great. And I didn't write a column about it immediately, even though I'm a columnist, because I didn't think it was that big a deal. But when I finally did write a column, Why I Let My 9-Year-Old Ride the Subway Alone, you're right, I ended up on all these television shows. And it was sort of across the board, because I was on Fox and NPR and MSNBC. It was just, everybody was interested in this topic. And the thing that amazed me and that sort of brings me here today is that after all the chatter and the back and forth thing, and did he have fun, and did he like it, and was it surprising, the interviewer, whoever it was, would always ask, that's nice, but how would you have felt if he never came home? And I was like, I don't know, I got a spare son at home. He's the older one, he's smarter. I didn't know what to say, and it took me years of getting that same question to finally realize that that's at the point where we're at. We're at the point where if you let your kid do something on their own, you're bad. because you haven't thought about the worst possible case scenario. He'll never come home before you let him do it. And so I started the whole free-range kids movement to say I love safety, car seats, seat belts, mouth guards, extra layers. You wouldn't believe how many extra layers I'm wearing today. You probably can't even see this extra layer because I know hotels are cold. So I'm prepared for bad things, but I don't think we always have to be prepared for the very worst, as if we live in the most dangerous times ever. And in fact, in terms of crime, we're back to the crime rate of 1963, which I realize is a sort of dangerous era in Texas. I mean, it's fine if you weren't president, but the point is that we're acting, sorry, not in Austin, but we're acting as if children are in constant danger, and the second they leave the house, they need a security detail. And as you were just saying, your childhood, and I think everybody's childhood here, was something that we cherish because we did have some independence. And so I just want to make sure that parents don't have to second guess giving their kid some chance to walk to school, to play outside, to go to the park, if they're so worried that maybe they would end up investigated or arrested like Carrie Ann Roy was here in Austin. So that's it. I love children, I love safety, but I think they deserve some independence, and so do parents deserve the independence to choose how they want to raise their kids. That's me.
So how does growing up this way benefit kids?
Oh, gosh. You know, we were talking before this started with an attendee. I don't know if he's in here. He worked at NASA for 36 years, you know, sent a man to the moon, et cetera. And I said, so do you see anything in your own childhood that maybe was a connection between what you did as a kid and what you ended up doing, you know, sending people to the moon? And he said, yeah, when he was a kid, he had scads of free time and a lot of nails, is what he said.
A lot of nails.
And he would go into the woods or into his backyard and make things. And he actually made, what did he say? He made a capsule. He made a space capsule. He designed his own replica space capsule. Yeah. I think when kids have the freedom to figure out what they really want to do, when they organize their own games, when they get to know the neighbors, when they become brave because they get lost and then they came home again, all those things are really beneficial for building a kid with, you know, focus and resilience and creativity. And when we're with them all the time, helping them, concierging them, bonsaiing these, you know, perfect little trees that don't get to leave the house, there's anxiety is spiking. You know, childhood anxiety is like off the charts. There's weird charts that go like this, like that, in the last decade or so, because we've been so concerned about our children's safety that we actually stunt them by being with them all the time. So I think if you want a country, Texas for God's sake, with a little bit of can-do spirit and moxie and independence, you know, kids have to grow up with some.
What was fascinating about the conversation that you were talking about that we had was he got into talking about the NASA interview process.
Oh, yeah.
And now one of the common questions that NASA will ask new recruits is, what did you do as a kid?
Right.
And what they're trying to figure out is, did you tinker? Did you do what the gentleman we were speaking with did, go out in the woods and build your own replica space capsule? Because what they're finding is the kids who are coming out of MIT and have these advanced degrees, who are brilliant with computers, brilliant with physics, brilliant with math, have grown up in such a structured environment that none of them really tinkered growing up and don't have that thought process that applied at Apollo 13 when the rule book went out the window and you had to figure it out on the fly. The kids that are applying to NASA today don't have that, and that's why NASA's asking them, what did you do as a kid, to figure out if they have that skill to think creatively on the fly under pressure. So as I mentioned earlier, Corey Widen was unable to be with us today. But she and her husband made some very similar parenting decisions to what we're talking about, and it landed them in a little bit of hot water. So I want to go ahead and show their story on the video.
That mother fighting back against mom shaming after being investigated by Child Services, all because a neighbor called the police when she let her daughter walk the dog by herself. We're going to speak with Corey Widen and her 8-year-old daughter, Dorothy, in just a moment. But first, a closer look at their story. This morning, a parenting debate raging after the police were called on this mother and daughter.
I saw the police just there, like the police's car, and I heard the sirens going off.
I said, did I do something wrong? And she said, well, how old is she? And I said, she's 8. And she said, okay, well, we got a call that she was 5 or under.
8-year-old Dorothy Widen was out by herself walking her dog Marshmallow in her Chicago neighborhood earlier this month when someone called the cops. That call leading to a visit from police and an investigation from the Department of Children and Family Services.
They found it unfounded, but it took a lot to get to that point.
Lenore Skenazy, an advocate for the free-range parenting movement, says independence is important for children.
When you give your kids independence, it's a chance for them to become resilient.
Earlier this year, Utah's governor signed a bill giving parents the freedom to allow their children to do more activities independently without being penalized for child neglect, like walking to school, playing outside, and staying home alone. New York and Texas are now considering similar legislation. And in a statement to ABC News, Illinois Department of Children and Family Services says, we did what the people of Illinois asked us to do. We investigated. We found no wrongdoing on the part of this mother, and we closed the case last week. So Mom, Corey, and daughter Dorothy and their little dog Marshmallow are all joining us live now. And Corey, I have to ask you what your initial reaction was when that doorbell rang and you saw police on the other side of the door.
Shock, anger, fear. My first response was I thought they were there for fundraising or something, but when I found out what the call was really about, I just couldn't believe it.
And then I'm sure you felt equally appalled that it was a neighbor who called police. What do you say to people who say, hey, 8 years old is too young to walk a dog by herself on a neighborhood street?
I would say every 8-year-old is different, every neighborhood is different, every parent is different, so you can't make an overall judgment like that.
Yeah, talk a little bit about where you live, your neighborhood, and why you felt it was safe for Dorothy to walk Marshmallow.
We live in a beautiful neighborhood. We're very fortunate. We live on the North Shore of Chicago, Wilmette, Illinois. It's safe, it's clean, it's beautiful. We're very lucky. We stretch and sacrifice to be there, but that's why, because it's safe.
Yeah, and Dorothy, why do you like walking Marshmallow?
Because like, it's very fun. I'm walking him, and I like it when he like walks on this side and of the sidewalk, and I look that he's like very fluffy and stuff like that.
He is super cute, and I'm sure I know this is a chore. I have a chore for my children too, to walk the dog. This is something that you think is important for Dorothy, and you believe you get to make that decision as a mother.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also homeschool my kids. So Dorothy, this was something we did to start giving her more independence because I didn't feel that she had enough. So I wanted to make that step of her being away from me a little bit more.
And I want to ask you, because the department obviously did what they had to do in terms of the law investigating you and your family, but what does that do to your children to see and feel what happens when an investigator comes to your home? And it's a pretty invasive process.
Very invasive, and it's traumatizing for the kids, always, and there's no way to shield them from it. I do think that changes need to be made because the call should have never gotten as far as it was. The initial call was for an unattended 5-year-old, and once they knew I didn't even have a 5-year-old, it should have stopped there. Yeah. I don't think it should have ever even made it past the hotline that a little girl walking her dog needs to be investigated.
What do you hope people take away from this story?
Don't judge a book by its cover. You don't know every situation. You don't know every child. And that when you do things like this, you overwhelm an already overwhelmed system with nuisance calls like this. And kids and families who really need help don't get it then.
Corey, Dorothy, Marshmallow, thank you. He was a very good dog during
this. Thank you.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live events.
Is that? Same with that.
All right. All right, let's return to our normal activities. A point comes up frequently in this conversation, and it's the point about fear. Parents fearing that they're going to be second-guessed, society fearing that the worst is going to happen. And whether or not you call it fear, I think there definitely is an awareness and uncertainty around how we as private citizens can live our lives and what the government might do if we make choices for our family that we feel are responsible and reasonable, but somebody else thinks are outside of the mainstream. So I'd like to bring Trevor into the conversation to speak to this issue from his perspective as an attorney and as deputy commissioner with DFPS. Trevor, off the top, how does Texas protect the freedom of parents like Corey to make these reasonable decisions to just let their kids be kids?
Well, we want children to be children. I have 3 children. They're 7, 5, and 3. I want them to have these experiences. Yeah. And I want to thank Lenore. You know, it's somebody with your esteem coming and sharing this really helps our child welfare system. You know, I think we'll talk a little later about neglectful supervision and such, but here in Texas, we have pretty clear definitions and guiding principles on what's abuse and neglect. And so we'll talk about our process by which calls come to statewide intake, et cetera, but the guiding principle is always a statutory definition of neglect, which I think in Texas is pretty narrow.
Let's go ahead and jump into that question. By far, like you said, one of the most common reasons that children are removed is for neglect, or is often called neglectful supervision. Last year, this one category accounted for more than 50,000 confirmed cases, nearly 71% of all cases. When you look at the code, there is some specificity in there, but it still does seem pretty broad. So when the department's interpreting what it means when they get a call for neglect or neglectful supervision, what's the process for interpreting that statute?
Sure. So the definition for neglect is very large, okay? And there are 5 broad categories of neglect, neglectful supervision being one. There's also medical neglect, physical neglect, when a parent refuses responsibility, and when they simply abandon their children. So all 5 of those things comprise neglect. Excuse me. And 3 sections of the statute specifically speak to neglectful supervision. And by far the largest category of cases where we find neglectful supervision on are cases where there are drug abuse or domestic violence, okay? Because those fit one of the 3 statutory definitions that we interpret to be neglectful supervision. Our policy mirrors word for word the statute, okay? And so I think it's important to note, you said 50,000 confirmed cases. So that's 50,000 of neglectful supervision, not necessarily what we're talking about here. That's going to include the drug abuse or domestic violence, okay? And then also, that will include cases in which there's also finding of physical abuse, okay? So it could be that we find physical abuse and neglect as well. So I think it's important to know for context purposes, we're not talking 50,000 of these cases. We're talking 50,000 of the 5 broad categories, a smaller subset of which would be these.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that broader category. What are the things that fall into that? As you look at the data, you do see that the vast majority are under the broad category of neglect. Much smaller percentages are the physical abuse or even the sexual abuse. So let's talk a little bit about that broader category. How do you go about screening those neglect calls?
So I think we got 600,000 total calls to statewide intake last year. Last fiscal year. About less than half of those actually concerned abuse and neglect of children in care, okay? So when a call is made, we also take e-reports, there are about 180,000 of those. When a call is made, we have somebody, an expert at statewide intake, 24/7, 365, who takes that call. They will gather information from the reporter, they will look at history, and then they will match that to the statutory definitions of abuse and neglect to determine if that should be sent on for investigation. Last year, out of the 295,800 some odd calls that involved abuse and neglect of children, 19% of those were immediately shut down by statewide intake. They didn't meet the statutory definition, perhaps DFPS didn't have jurisdiction. That's usually what happens in those cases. Okay. Of the remaining 81% or so, that's sent out to the field. And then we have a second set of eyes. So basically you've got what I consider 2 mini investigations before somebody actually knocks on your door. We have folks in the field we call screeners. They're typically tenured caseworkers. They were supervisors before, maybe they were child safety specialists. They have particular expertise in making these decisions. So they would review each of these cases, and typically this type of case would go out, would be a priority 2, not a priority 1. Okay, so the screener is going to sit and review this stuff, and they're going to make additional phone calls. They'll call collaterals, they'll call the reporter.
Wait, what's a collateral?
Somebody else connected to the case. Okay, so for instance, we may get a call from a social worker that says mom and child aren't bonding well in the hospital. Okay, but a collateral may be a doctor. So we would call the doctor, and the doctor would say, no, the family's fine. Then that case would be closed. Okay, so collateral will be anybody connected with the case that we can determine. We might call and get additional information, doing our due diligence before somebody comes to your home. Okay, again, of these cases we're talking about, there are going to be P2s. We have in Texas what we call alternative response. Okay, I think all states are required to have it, but Texas at any rate has it. And that is a different type of investigation than your traditional investigation. Okay. Typically, folks just don't show up on the door. It's prearranged. Things are explained ahead of time, and we go out and do an investigation. There were about 23,000 of those last year that fall into the AR category. Again, we're not talking about children riding subways or walking dogs. Any priority 2 that made it through screening that was one of the 23,000 would be in that alternative response category.
Wait, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So Carrie Ann Roy, whose 6-year-old was playing outside, how did she end up being investigated?
So, and I think one thing that Ms. Widen mentioned I think was really important, and I think she was spot on. We're talking about individual cases, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you have is somebody on the phone taking information. They're going to ask questions. The screener's going to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. But if it is unclear, or if they don't have enough information, then that may generate an investigation. You know, when you look at the statutory definition, you look at the Utah law too, a child may be chronologically 8, okay, but developmentally they may not be 8. We don't know that, okay? And so if you can't determine those type things in calls, that may generate an investigation.
So following up on that, what type of accountability is there for the person who refers a case out for investigation when it is the case of like Carrie Ann or like Corey's, where a child is just walking their dog or just playing in the park within eyesight of the parent who's in the house? Is there an accountability system that says you're overloading our caseworkers with these calls that they really shouldn't be responding to, and it's taking them away from the really important cases that they need to be on?
If we're grossly missing things, and then they'll show me accountability, people will call in, we'll find it out. But in these cases, I think that we have a robust enough system that cases go out where people really think that something's on the line, and so they go check it out. Again, we're statutorily charged with investigating this. We're statutorily charged with abuse and neglect. And so when a founded call comes in, and we can't determine whether it should be ruled out immediately, then we're going to take the appropriate steps.
Okay, great. So Trevor, one more question. What in your view is the role of the courts as it relates to actions taken by CPS, especially in investigations?
Well, you know, the courts are huge. Personally, some of my biggest accomplishments I feel in my career have been when I was representing parents and children. I love working for the agency. I love the work, but both sides are equally important. And so I think that our legislature has done a very good job of drawing a balance, or good balance, between parental rights and the need for child protection. I think our courts do the same. I've tried jury trials and bench trials across the state at the trial level. I've either argued or written in every appellate court and appeared before the Texas Supreme Court. In every case, the justices and the judges pay the greatest attention to these. And I think they do the absolute best they can to follow the law. And that's a very important check and balance on the system, a check and balance as a lawyer that I'm happy to have.
For a family like Corey's, who wants to challenge the investigation, who wants to challenge what happened to them, how do they go about doing that?
Challenge as in
terms of, I don't think this should have happened to me. What recourse do they have after the invasion of their private life and obviously the trauma that caused? We were all nodding along when Corey said the investigation is traumatic for the kids. You know,
and for her. I talked to her last night.
Absolutely.
She said she is having nightmares and her daughter won't walk the dog anymore. Her daughter's afraid to walk the dog.
So obviously you can't speak to Illinois, but if that were to happen in Texas, what recourse would a parent like Corey have?
So DFPS operates the Office of Consumer Relations, all right? It's an independent ombudsman group that exists outside of the programs. It actually reports up through my chain of the Deputy Commissioner's office. Parents at any time can call and make a report there alleging some sort of violation of policy or something wrong with the case. Our team of folks will research that, and if there's a problem, they will substantiate that. And then quarterly reports are produced. Programs are able to identify where the work may be needed, because we're always constantly improving to stay within the bounds of the law and stay within the bounds of our policy.
Okay, great. We spoke about Utah and a recent law that they passed, actually the first state in the nation to pass legislation meant to address this problem and help restore a little bit of the freedom that children have lost over the last few decades. That law clarified the definition of neglect, and I'm reading from the definition itself in the Utah law, and it says that neglect does not include permitting a child whose basic needs are met and who is of sufficient age and maturity to avoid harm or the unreasonable risk of harm, to engage in independent activities. So on one hand, it's a pretty common sense solution that protects the fundamental liberty of kids to just be kids and to have a measure of freedom and independence. But on the other hand, the fact that our society seems to be in a place where we now have to pass laws to protect good parents from having the government micromanage their parenting decision is troubling. On the third hand, it keeps me in a job, so.
Waiting for that third hand there.
The third hand, right? The child protective system is an unpleasant necessity. While recognizing that government does have a role to play in protecting children from abuse, I want to ask you both, how can we meet the responsibility as a society, and how can the child welfare system specifically meet its responsibilities without violating the rights of innocent families? And Lenore,
I'll jump in. So, I'm really glad CPS exists, because the idea of a child who is literally neglected or literally abused, even more scary and horrifying, is terrible, and I want that to stop, and I want those parents to stop doing that. I don't think just simply seeing a kid outside, walking to school, walking the dog, playing, should ever kick off an investigation. At this moment in America, 1 out of every 10 children will be investigated by Child Protective Services every year. And if you're black, it's 53%. And that means that you have to be thinking about that in the back of your mind. And I don't think that everybody is. I mean, I obviously hear from the parents who are most concerned about this issue. But I do hear from parents saying, oh, I'd like her to walk to school, but I don't want to be turned into CPS. Or I want him to go to the park, but I can't do that because what if a neighbor calls? And there's two things going on. One is this extreme concern that anytime a child is unsupervised, they're automatically in danger, which is exaggerated. And the other thing is that everybody's got a phone. So suddenly, if you saw a kid playing in the park and you thought, oh, that kid looks a little young, you're not going to remember that half an hour later when you're back at your house and search for a number. You're just not going to call that in. But this conflation of, oh my God, a child alone, I better call the 911 because that's like a lemur escaped from the zoo. I never see them outside anymore. Very few kids walk to school even. 11% of kids walk to school now. So you see this kid alone, you remember a horrible case of something terrible happening, you get to be the hero, you've got a phone and you have no idea. You might even think that you're being a good Samaritan. You have no idea that now Corey is opening her door and there's a Child Protective Services worker who's going to come in, or Carrie Ann Roy opens the door. First there's the mean neighbor, then there's the cops, then there's the Child Protective Service person who insists on, I'm going to interview each of your children, you can't be with me, and tell me what she was very upset about. And if you read the article we printed out, is that when they were interviewing her kids, they asked her 8-year-old about drugs, this and that, and then they said, do your parents ever show you movies where there are naked adults with their private parts showing? And the kid is like, what? And so instead of protecting this kid, now they've introduced her this weird and disturbing idea that her parents might have been showing her naked people in a movie that she didn't even know those movies existed. So you really have to, I'd say, take a conservative stance on how quickly we want the government to be knocking on any family's door. And I think that doing anything like letting our kids have an old-fashioned childhood like we all cherished is certainly not reason enough to knock on the door. So if there's something truly disturbing, a kid is in rags and they're covered with cigarette burns and you see them sitting next to the trash can and drinking Johnny Walker or whatever, call CPS, and I really want them to investigate, but I'd be happy to have your people have more time to investigate those cases and no time spent knocking on the door of a lady who let her 6-year-old play outside in front of the house. That's all the law does. It reassures parents that they don't have to second guess these very simple, everyday decisions of, can I let my kid walk home? Can I let my kid play in the park?
Trevor, same question for you.
So I think conversations like this are helpful because I think it's an educational piece that's missing. Mm-hmm. If you look at the plain language of the neglectful supervision sections, I think that they pretty closely mirror what Utah has done. talks about what an ordinary person would think is appropriate, whether it's developmentally appropriate. So, you know, the difficulty is Texas law requires each of us, all of us, if you have a concern for suspected abuse, to call that in. I think that's appropriate. And so when that call is made, very rarely is there the child who's covered in sores laying next to a garbage can. It does happen. It's horrible. And I see it all too often. But that's not the majority of our calls, okay? And so when we're talking about individual families, individual children, and only so much as a parent on the surface, sometimes you're going to have intakes go out. Sometimes we're going to do that investigation. And if we are going to go to a home and do an investigation, I think it's important that we do a thorough investigation. It doesn't need to be any more invasive than necessary. But unfortunately, there are times where we go into a home for one reason and find something entirely different. There's horrible abuse and neglect going on that isn't service level.
And you mentioned something in the middle of your comments that I think is important to clarify as well. In Texas, we have a universal mandatory reporter statute. That means that every single Texan under the laws is a mandatory reporter. If you see or suspect child abuse or neglect, the law actually requires you to report that suspicion. In some states, it's limited to people who have specific roles in society, like teachers, doctors. In Texas, it's universal. If you're a Texan, you're a mandatory reporter under the law.
That sort of goes back to the idea that, you know, I was asked, how would you have felt if he never came home? If you are, you know, our society is sort of steeped in fear now, and it is becoming more unusual to see kids outside on their own. And I read a statistic that 6% of kids ages 9 to 13 play outside for an hour, not in a team these days. So as it becomes unusual to see children on their own, and you think you're a mandated reporter, and you're a hero, and you got the phone, there are these calls that are coming in, and I would just like the intake person to say, is the child playing? Yes. Or walking outside? Yes. Are they with a dog named Marshmallow? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and be able to hang up then and say that that's not against the law. And so I don't have to worry as a mom that I'm sending my kids out to get a Slurpee or bike ride to the library. I don't have to. People call me and they say, I'm not letting my kid do that because I don't want Child Protective Services knocking on my door. So this, if we clarify it with a law like Utah's, it sounds like those are not the cases you want to investigate either, where it's just kids playing outside. But I, as a parent, would be very reassured to know that it is enshrined in my set of laws in my state that this is not illegal. I don't have to worry. I'm the mother. I know my kid is at 6 ready to play outside, at 8 ready to walk the dog. The Métis of Maryland were a famous case where they let their 10 and 6-year-old walk home from the park. They were investigated twice. I don't think parents should have to worry that the state is going to second guess their decent parenting.
And it's especially important in light of the mandatory reporter statute that we have.
Right.
Teachers, doctors, they get specific training.
Right, they're
you
scared
can't
of
train
not reporting. Right.
every single Texan on this, and we have this culture of fear and uncertainty that's existing in society. So the law clarifies, right? It provides a roadmap for people that you all aren't able to reach and train.
Right.
You do a wonderful job training your people, as you should be doing. But it's really hard to make sure everybody in the state understands that level of detail on what is not worth reporting. So the clarity of the law, I think, aids in that.
Right, and it also brings it to public attention. And so they go, oh, that's, I didn't realize that was a problem. I'm glad to have it cleared up. Or if they were worried about it, now they know, okay, that's not illegal. Phew, okay, go run an errand for me. Wouldn't it be nice to have kids running errands for us again instead of having to drive them everywhere? So.
And what it really comes back to, this conversation that we're having, as I was reflecting on this panel, and even reflecting on my own family and our friends, our community that we live in. It's that sense of community, going back to that Pew Research poll. 1 in 3 Americans know all or most of their neighbors today. The root cause of this problem is not necessarily the symptoms that we're talking about. What we're talking about today is a symptom of a broader problem of community breakdown, of a breakdown in civil society. So both of you, as a New Yorker and as a Texan, what do you see that we can do to strengthen our communities, to strengthen our civil society, so that these type of instances, this symptom, doesn't occur nearly as much?
I think the answer is community-based care. Last session, the department was given funding and authority to move forward with community-based care and really restructuring the way we care for kids.
I don't even know what community-based care is.
Let's talk about community-based care. So community-based care is a brand new model by which we empower lead agencies and communities to care for kids in those communities. Okay, and so it's designed to keep kids close to home. It's designed to energize the community. And community-based care, there's the part where children enter care, but there's also the whole component before kids come into care, okay? There's services can be offered to keep children together. There's prevention services before there's even, when the pot's just starting to boil, can you turn the heat off then and offer some preventive services? And it's really allowing communities to take charge of this whole situation and really own it and care for folks. Many years ago, there was no need for a Department of Family Protective Services because there were communities. And I would like to see us return to that community focus. And I think through those local connections, through those community discussions, things can be clarified, folks can understand what is and is not abuse and neglect, and communities can wrap around folks and hopefully keep the department from ever becoming part of the situation. And if we do, speedily work to either return the kid home or get them to permanence.
And thank you for that, because you set me up to plug our next panel for tomorrow morning.
That was the plan.
Center for Families and Children is hosting a panel tomorrow morning digging into community-based care, assessing the current state of implementation and looking at the vision forward for the further expansion of the community-based care model. So we hope you'll attend that. Lenore, how can we...
Do we have time left, can I say?
We do, yes.
Okay, so community sounds great. I think in the olden days there probably was a reason for, there would have been, CPS would have been good for like the Dickensian childhood. So that's what I still, am grateful for CPS being. But, community doesn't have to just be the government coming up with a way of caring for the kids. Community starts with community. And you can't really have community if everybody's in their car driving around and nobody gets to know each other. And so you have to have, they say that a good barometer of whether a neighborhood is sort of a healthy one is, are there kids outside? Because if there are kids outside, then everybody's getting to know each other. It means that there's stoplights. It means that the old people can also cross the street because the lights wait long enough. And you can't have that kind of neighborhood if you're worried about sending your kid outside. So I just have to tell you the story I heard yesterday, which is somebody wrote to my site on our blog yesterday, which is letgrow.org. Some parents were saying that they wanted their kid to be able to walk home from, they have a therapy thing, occupational therapy once a week. They wanted their kid to walk home 1 block from the therapy office to their home. And the therapy office said no. And so today on my blog is the waiver that they finally wrote. Okay, I agree that it's dangerous and I understand the dangers, and even though it's dangerous, I let my kid walk home. So they signed that. But then another lady wrote to me and said, I had an argument with my school. The school bus drops the kids off now, not at a bus stop because that's several houses away. They stop at everyone's driveway and they drop the kid off at the bottom of the driveway. And her school was saying, you have to be there to meet the kid to walk them into your house. So she's arguing with them. I wrote her, I said, please write me more details and send a picture of your driveway. But in the meantime, how can you have a community when you're not even trusting, that your kid can make it from the sidewalk to the front door? And that the government or the school district, which is governmentally run, is telling you that you are not allowed to trust your kid outside for, 50 feet, 20 feet, I don't know how long a driveway is. So really, to create community, you almost have to get it re-normalized that kids can be outside without these security guards, and that they can go to the park, they can knock on each other's doors. And you're not going to have a community if everybody is in their little embryo, which is the SUV, going here and going there, and the children only get out to play a game that you watch, and then they get back in the car, and then you drive them to Kumon, and they get their homework, and then you drive them home, and then it's time for bed. So you can't create community if there is no community out there, people interacting. That's what community is.
That's a great point. Please join me in thanking our experts. We're going to have a few minutes for Q&A. All right, if you have a question, just raise your hand. A microphone will be brought over to you. So I see here, there's a few on this side. Where's my mic master?
Or just
They're coming.
Oh, right, no, it's streaming. You're gonna streaming.
Sir.
Wait, here comes the mic lady.
Incidentally, I'm really impressed that you guys are addressing this issue because, like I think Kevin Roberts said at the beginning, and Andrew, you did too, is that we're talking about first principles, and I think what Lenore said is that this is symptomatic. And so, what are we going to do to get back to the first principles of neighborliness and stuff like that?
Responsibility.
And I got to tell you that I have been for a long time, used to be on the board, but now volunteer for a long time, a CASA volunteer.
Oh.
And I'm sure you know all about that. And it's a privilege to be a part of that. And anybody who sits around trying to beat up CPS is dumb. Because you guys are the result of our failure as a community to do the right thing, right? And along with that, maybe a charter for Lenore and both you guys. You talk about the unit CASA, which stands for Court
Appointed Special Advocates.
Yeah. We're there after the court has decided this is a viable case. And I think the relationship we have together really works well. At the same time, before, and this is what Lenore is working at, maybe there should be called a homeowners association, but anything, we ought to deputize the neighborhood and say, you have to, if we're going to build a neighborhood again, we have to, that would be a charter that I think Lenore could carry on, it won't be a CASA, but there's probably a CASA version that can happen before there's even these incidences that are reported. And so the neighbor wouldn't call because the neighbor knows that child. Mm-hmm. And I know it's a perfect world, but I think it's doable, at least to get over your head. And so the idea that maybe you folks can charter something like that and get back to the first principles that Andrew pointed out here is really a noble thing. And that's what TPPF's about, is to get back to first principles and not sit around and play the ain't it awful game, because that takes everybody's time and of no value. But instead to say, let's get back to where we need to go and address the first principles to do it.
You make a really good point about community institutions and people getting involved to help their neighbors in need. And there are a lot of wonderful models by private nonprofit organizations. A lot come through local churches or places of worship where families in the community, if they see a problem, if there's somebody in their community that's struggling. And a lot of times these issues are based in poverty. If you get right back down to the root cause, it's because a family doesn't have a job. They don't have the resources that they need. They don't have the support structure that they need, and problems start spiraling out of control. A lot of the great nonprofit organizations out there have family mentorship type programs, and really it's just extended family relationships. It's friendship, right, where someone in need is matched up with someone who can help, and it's natural, it's not compelled, and you end up seeing families who otherwise would never have interacted have these incredibly close bonds. And the best part about it is the kids stay with their parents, and DFPS never has to get involved because the community's taking care of their own. That's a wonderful point.
Before the next question, I just want to thank you for your work as a CASA. The great partner of ours. You do wonderful work, and I appreciate your point. It's a system, and DFPS is one part of the system, and CASA is another important part. So I appreciate you pointing out we need to think about this globally.
Right here.
Thank you. Two-part question. One, it seems I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this is related to the phenomenon of mom shaming.
Oh my God,
and,
my favorite topic.
Things like breastfeeding or not breastfeeding long enough or not doing it at all, and heaven forbid having a glass of wine while you're 7 months pregnant, hypothetically.
Really, certainly not tonight.
And so is that its whole kind of a theme is all related, and then also what has caused this? Because it seems to me like my childhood was probably very similar to yours and to some of the prior generations in the room, and this all seems to have happened very
so
quickly.
fast. Yeah.
So what's the cause of all of it?
Can I talk? First of all, let me just talk about mom shaming for a second. It is all of a piece. I mean, basically, the people often who are calling 911, the woman who brought Carrie Ann Roy's 6-year-old back, was not to say, I was looking after him, he looked so young, I just wanted to make sure you know he's out there. It wasn't that. It's like, did you know he's out there? Why would you let him out there? And basically, and then she allows the government to come and continue the shaming by calling 911 and throwing her life into turmoil. So there's this idea that the second you take your eyes off your kids, you are not doing your job. So of course it is all shaming. I mean, if you look online, there's just so many instances of, there was one of my favorite ones, if you can call it that, was of a mom who went to pay for her gas and the kid was waiting in the car for, 3 minutes? And she comes back and a guy is videotaping her. Oh, mom of the year, great mom. You know, you left the kid there, nobody's watching him. It's like, you seem to be watching him. It's like, no, he could have been, it's just, there's this desire, this blood sport out there, and it's very difficult. And speaking of the wine thing, last year the CDC said that any woman of childbearing age who is not on birth control should not take a sip of alcohol. So that's what, 13 to me, you know, no alcohol. It's just a couple of, well, maybe it's 4 decades, but still, you know, you're only seen as, if you're not creating the absolute optimal, 100% perfect according to, some incredible standard mom, then you stink. So I think it is all of the piece that then we're happy to call 911 and teach you a lesson. And afterwards I'll tell you about an amazing study done at University of California, Irvine, of mom shaming, but it's too long to explain. But what was your other question? Because I wanted to jump on that. Oh, what caused all that? Oh, I wrote a whole book. I'm just going to whip us through really fast. It's the media is more pervasive than ever. They love nothing more than the story of a white middle or upper middle class child who was kidnapped by a stranger. It's such a rare instance that we went to Portugal for the Maddie McCann story. Nobody can remember anything else that's happened in Portugal except the Maddie McCann story, because that's the only story that mattered to us, white middle class kid. We live in a litigious society. You start thinking like lawyers, what could go wrong? What could I be blamed for? Expert society, experts are always telling you that you're doing it wrong so that they have something to say, which is why I don't call myself an expert. And the other thing is that you have small families and often 2 earners, and so there's a lot of money to be spent per kid. The marketers go in there, they know if they can make you afraid for your kid that something terrible is going to happen, either they're going to be kidnapped, raped, and eaten, or not get into Harvard, then they can sell you something. And so they are constantly trying to undermine your confidence that your kid is going to make it from one day to the next without buying something, doing something, reading something, enrolling in something that nobody ever had to use in the history of the world. And usually at this point at a lecture I would bring out my baby knee pads that are sold in all the stores because it's such a dangerous thing that you need padding like you're at in rugby. Actually, I know rugby, they don't use padding. Anyways, the point is that there's just a whole lot of new fears that are foisted on us so that things could be sold to us.
And I would add, I'm certainly not qualified to speak to mom shaming, but I
speak to dad shaming.
I will say that we do know that when you partner with a family and when you provide services, even whether the child's in care or not, it's much better if you try to provide that in a collegial and supportive environment instead of a blaming or judging environment. You just get much further. So I don't think that should be condoned at all.
I've read some of those discussion groups on the mom blog, and let me just say, moms are tough. Could not deal with that. Right here.
Trevor, quickly, this is kind of off the subject, but I'm just curious what the opioid crisis has had effect it's had on what you do.
Fortunately, Texas is not seeing a huge increase in removals or issues with opioids. We have methamphetamine is a large issue. We have some cocaine. We certainly have marijuana, but we do have a few opioid cases, but it has not hit us to the extent the rest of the country is affected yet.
Go Texas.
To follow up on that, while our microphone's making its way back across the room, how does the department respond for treatment of families that are maybe struggling with substance abuse without escalating things to the level of removing the kids and permanently separating that families? What resources are out there?
Well, you know, we always appreciate all the resources we can get. We have resources for drug treatment. We rely on community resources a lot for that. And each case is individual, right? So we have some cases in which the drug use can be treated at home, maybe through inpatient, the children remain there. Many jurisdictions have drug courts now. Right? And that's a way to move through the system without having the children removed. The parents are offered intensive services. It's a wonderful alternative where they're available. And then you have the extreme cases where the drug use is just so bad the children simply aren't safe in the home. And then we do our best to provide services to those parents.
One of the amazing things about community-based care is the innovation that's happening in the regions that are already up and running, or already starting to drum up more resources to address the problem of substance abuse at a lower level before intervention becomes necessary. We've got down front has been up, and then red shirt in the back next.
Hello, I actually used to work not for Trevor, but down the hall from Trevor. I'm a former attorney for Department of Family and Protective Services, and I left there actually to be an administrative law judge. So I have represented DFPS. I have ruled for and against DFPS in particular cases. One thing that I wanted to point out is that certainly, you know, you see and you hear a lot of cases, and it's very easy to point the finger at government and go, wow, that's something that the government should have been looked into. One of the things that I wanted to point out is in addition to what we've already said, or many of us have said, that I think is the base principle, that we don't know each other. We need to know each other. We need to start asking, well, did you even ask the child, where do you live? Do you even ask the child who your parent is?
Beautiful.
Do you even, in addition to asking that, we also need to understand that the Department of Family and Protective Services, in addition to investigating allegations of child abuse and neglect, is also charged with knowing something about the background of people who hold themselves out as regulated caregivers. And so, and by that I mean, if you work in a daycare or you work in a listed family home, the department is responsible for running background checks on folks that want to do that. And that very often is how those were the kinds of cases that I adjudicated and that I represented the department in. So a lot of times the issue was not whether or not somebody's child was going to be taken away or whether or not criminal charges should be filed. There was simply an administrative finding that a child was found in these circumstances that created some concern. And, you know, maybe not enough concern to do something as drastic as taking the child away, but it was amazing how many times cases go through the agency and then go on to an administrative law judge, where a person who has a history of, you know, for lack of a better description, let kids run wild, turns around and says, you know what, I'd actually like the state to pay me to take care of more foster kids. And that's the most benign example. There are other cases of neglect and abuse where that happens. So you know, part of the problem too is that we don't just expect the government to know us when we don't know each other. We also want the government to know the folks who take care of our kids when we're not. And I say I don't have any kids, but that's something to think about too. We expect them to be both the cops and the regulators, and that's something to think about when you look at folks that work for Trevor.
I think you're exactly right, Jeremy. You know, in last session, that regulatory licensing piece was actually shifted to HHSC. You know, and so I'm sure you've seen cases when it was within our jurisdiction and HHSC's jurisdiction. Of course, we partner closely with them on that, but that's another part of the system that we have to interface with. And of course, we are charged with investigating daycares, licensed daycares, et cetera. And so we have to fulfill that duty as well.
I think you made a really good point as well. People expect the government to be cops and regulators. And I would argue too that the society expects governments to be parents. And that's a misplaced expectation. Yeah. Government makes a terrible parent, and that's why some of these conversations happen. So I appreciate that feedback. We had red shirt.
Hi there. I'm an alumna of about 100 snake-infested Woodruff devoted bakers growing up. So,
How'd you survive?
And I'm also the mom of 6 and 8-year-old boys. And so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. One thing I've noticed is that our schools are, we've always kind of had these topics that our teachers teach our children, where they have a unit on stranger danger. And I go back and forth with my children's school. It's a wonderful school, but on this issue, we don't quite see eye to eye. I've tried to mention to them that I want my kids to talk to strangers.
Right.
I'm continually encouraging my children to talk to strangers.
Arrest her.
Talk to strangers, because that's how we build a community, right?
Right.
So how do we, and I mean, I think the stranger danger notion came about a little bit after my own childhood. How do we
Dial that back?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is the group that put the pictures on the milk cartons, the pictures of missing children, and said, "Have you seen me?" And they neglected to add asterisk, "I was taken in a custodial dispute." It's like, it seemed like all these children had been abducted by strangers, which was wrong. And then we got the whole stranger danger thing. We got McGruff the dog, who's the creepiest of all. Right, get away. He's in a trench coat, for God's sake. But so the thing that so anyways, NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, itself has said stranger danger is the wrong thing to teach kids. And in fact, if your kid is out and they're being followed by the guy in the white van with the balloons and the candy, you want the kid to be able to run across the street to the stranger and say, "I'm just going to stand here with you while that van goes by." And so to tell kids never to talk to strangers is actually making them less safe and also creating the opposite of community. What you said is that everybody that you don't know is a danger to you, when in fact the vast majority of crimes against children are committed by people they know. So what I tell people, and what a lot of other people do too, I stole it from a psychologist, is tell your kids that they can talk to strangers, they can talk to anyone, they can't go off with anyone. And that's much easier for them to understand in there, because when you're talking to the lady at the grocery, is she a stranger, is she a friend, you don't even know. So you can talk to anyone, can't go off with anyone. That's just a better rule. I have no ability to choose who speaks next.
Right there in the back.
Yeah, I find the law that you mentioned a little bit troubling and Orwellian. Because what you're saying, if I had seen the 2 kids playing in the park and didn't call DPS, then subjectively I could be arrested because I wasn't paying attention enough to someone else's standard of what a child could and couldn't do. And that's up to a wide range of interpretation that we've seen here in the different evidence. So how are you going to balance that with someone's rights as an individual? And
it sounds like the law you're talking about is
the mandatory
mandated
reporter
law. Yeah, it is Orwellian.
Well, I may take issue with that. So I have never seen anybody arrested or prosecuted, a layperson, for not making a report. I think that may be an issue if you're a professional reporter, okay? A doctor, teacher, something like that. And as you stand here before me, I would consider you an ordinary, reasonable person, okay? That's the standard. And so if in your mind, as you drive by a park and there's some children playing and they look like sufficient age and they don't appear to have any developmental issues and you have no concerns, it's kids playing in the park, just like my 5-year-old and 7-year-old play at the park, okay?
They do?
Now, if
wait.
They do.
They do, that's very cool.
They do. Now, if my 3-year-old is out there unattended, that'd be something different.
Yeah, I would think
okay?
so too.
And so, please don't think that the department or law enforcement is riding around in vans looking for folks not reporting child abuse. It's what's reasonable to you. And I think we can all be here as competent adults and determine in our mind what's child abuse and what's not.
Wait, so let me just ask a question about, so if the 7 and 5-year-old were there and they had the 3-year-old with them, that's fine with you, right? I mean, that's okay? Your kids are watching? I mean, I think that is good. If you think that's fine, I would think that's fine.
I would think that would come in and they would ask some additional questions. I don't know how it would come out, And that's that's the case here. You know, you cannot lay hard and fast rules down with ages. You know, what my 7-year-old was premature. He's got some challenges. Very bright kid, okay? What he can do at 7, my 5-year-old will be able to do more at 7, okay? They're different kids, and I love them both to death, okay? And as a parent, I have to make that determination.
So
but somebody driving by, calling in, they won't know that. Okay?
Right, so they'll think, oh my God, a 5-year-old outside with just a 7-year-old watching them, let me call 911. And I would feel upset if that happened to me and the cops or CPS came knocking and saying, somebody reported that there were these 2 young children at the park, they're not old enough to be alone.
And I guess that's my point, because I'm not aware of any other mandatory requirement for any other crimes.
Right.
And Trevor, you're the expert in your own kids. Nobody knows your kids like you do, and you should have the right to make that call, as you clearly do in a very responsible way.
And I think Texas law allows for that and protects it.
Right in the back and then just in front.
Thanks so much. I strongly believe that we have created a nanny state in the United States, and we've got a major issue with that. Trevor, I thank you for being here today. I'm actually a foster parent.
Thank you.
Licensed foster care. Our child just went back to live with her grandma, which we're very excited about. We've seen some major changes since the last legislative session, and I actually saw an a rare species, which is a caseworker that's been with CPS for more than a year. And I think that's thanks to the changes that occurred in the last legislative session. And so, Trevor, one of the things that I'd love for you to take back to the department is how do we get more foster care parents engaged and involved and want to do it? Let me tell you from my perspective that one of the biggest hurdles with me even wanting to continue my license is that every year I have to go back and I have to learn how to restrain a kid that I may never have in my house. I have to go and learn every year 30 hours of continual education on top of also having a foster kid in my house. It may sound like 30 hours is nothing, but when you have to travel an hour or 2 hours to the location and you can only get 3 or 4 hours of education at any given time, the education portion of foster care, for me and a lot of people that I run with, it's the biggest deterrent to wanting to maintain a foster care license. And it's not something that I've seen a whole lot of focus on from a legislative perspective. I don't think there should be from an interdepartmental perspective. I'd love to see some changes and how to get rid of stupid education that doesn't matter and focus on what does matter. Let's look at the mass, not at the very small things. So Trevor, thank you for being here. I'd love for you to take that back and make some major changes in that. Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely will, and thank you for being a foster parent. You know, we could not do this work without you, period. And seeing good foster parents help kids, transform them, return them home, or move them to permanence is the reason we do this work every day. You know, I think that we have the best ever relationship we've had with providers in the history of the department. They're mobilized, we're mobilized, and we're continually meeting. We need to continue that and strengthen that. You know, there's multiple things that you're required to do. Some of it is by law, some of it's by contract, some of it's by minimum standards, and some is required by your CPA. And so we have to piece all that apart, right? So we can have the discussion of what does the department require that we can change, what does your CPA require that they can change? Because at the end of the day, we do want a good level of basic training. We want kids safe, but we want to encourage people to do it. We need more foster parents.
One last very quick question. We're almost out of time. Right there in the suit.
Yeah, I know you guys talked a little bit, sorry, it's the second day of session, I'm losing my voice already. But you guys talked about mandatory reporting. It seems like the bigger issue to me is anonymous reporting, which
yes.
this also has. And the combination of those two things is especially problematic, it seems like. So, I mean, mandatory reporting, most people in the state do not know they're mandatory reporters, but the fact that it's a prosecutable offense to make a false claim of child abuse, but you can also do it anonymously so nobody can prosecute you for it, seems to create kind of a circular problem that can't be solved. And the response I've always heard is, well, you have to make it anonymous so that somebody who doesn't want to feel retribution from the person you're reporting against doesn't happen. But you can
Right.
and still maintain the information inside the department so it is prosecutable. So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about that, especially how it is that we're supposed to police false reporting when we don't collect information about false reporting.
Yep.
It's a great question.
Yeah, you're the expert, and then I'll just add my 2 cents.
Yeah, I might jump in. So you're right. Texas law does make it a crime to make a false report. I think it's a Class B misdemeanor, maybe a Class A. And by law, the reporter's name is confidential. There's a whole procedure spelled on the family code by which a judge can make certain rulings and terminations and determine that the name should be released. So there is a mechanism by which if somebody's the subject of constant false reports, they can attempt to go get that name. But I'll tell you why I think it's important we have that anonymous aspect in there. It's not just about people who fear retribution. Sometimes we get family members who call who are aware of some very horrible things going on in the home. And it is just so conflicting to them to have to turn in their son or brother or niece. And they can't bring themselves to say their relationship, but they can tell you what's going on in the home. And sometimes you can determine who it is. But anything we can do to encourage people to have the freedom to call and make reports of abuse and neglect, and we can determine whether it's founded, is what I think we should be doing. I've sat with those statewide intake workers. I sat with the night shift just before Christmas, and I heard one of the most horrific stories that'll live with me the rest of my life. And they hear that every day. And those folks, as professional reporters, gave their names, but there was someone on another call, I'm sure, taking a similar report with somebody who didn't want to give their name, even though they're reporting things that were just as bad.
That does shake me up, but I've also heard the other side, which is parents who get reported by angry ex-spouses or angry ex-spouses' parents, and those people can call as often as they want, and each time the call, from what I understand, has to be treated as if it's significant, and so you can just keep dropping atom bombs into a family and have the government delivering them. And so I think confidential makes sense, but I think that everybody has to leave their name, otherwise you can just keep calling and harassing people via CPS.
I heard one of those too, and it was closed down and not sent to the field.
Good.
So that's part of the mix sometimes.
Yeah, it is confusing, but I think confidentiality makes more sense than anonymity.
Well, Lenore, Trevor, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you all for being here.